The landscape of medieval occupations was not limited to familiar forms of labor. It also included many professions that demanded a level of courage far beyond ordinary imagination. Many trades were tied to blood-fire disease or territorial disputes, forcing those who practiced them to accept daily risks. Small villages often whispered about dangerous occupations where a single mistake could cost one's life. Among them were jobs that existed quietly in the background, for no one willingly stepped into a path where danger constantly lurked. Those who dared to pursue such work were often driven by circumstance or possessed a steely resolve unlike that of ordinary people. Life under feudal lords meant that many professions risked being dragged into conflict, adding yet another layer of fear that shadowed every craftsman. Some jobs seemed peaceful on the surface, but carried high risks, especially in an era where medicine law and protective skills were still primitive. People who took on these professions could hardly avoid feeling isolated, for most villagers kept their distance, sometimes even shunning them entirely. They also faced natural disasters, wild beasts, or epidemics, forces capable of taking a life in an instant. Even so, certain professions endured across generations because society could not function without these shadowed, often unspoken roles. The tolling of church bells or the murmurs of the marketplace often hinted at the quiet presence of those in dangerous trades. Behind the village's peaceful facade were silent struggles where workers confronted danger in order to survive. Some occupations were feared because of their association with death, causing practitioners to be viewed as ominous, avoided by most. But others belonged to the realms of battle or hunting, requiring boldness to confront the wild and untamed forces of nature. These individuals often bore a hardened expression, their eyes accustomed to staring directly into danger, so different from the gentle demeanor of farmers. Their reputations spread far and wide, earning both respect and unease, for they were tied to things everyone wished to avoid. Children grew up hearing nighttime tales about these professions, both curious and afraid of the fates awaiting those who followed them. Though seen as ill-omened, those who worked dangerous jobs helped maintain order, food supplies, and safety within the community. Without them, many essential functions of society would collapse, proving their unique value despite the fragility of their lives. Stories about them became a kind of hidden culture, reflecting the darker yet truthful aspects of medieval European life. People always remembered that these occupations were necessary, even if few were willing to step into such perilous realms. That awareness nurtured a deeper respect for those who faced danger on behalf of the entire community. Through such observations, the portrait of hazardous medieval labor gradually came into sharper focus, urging people to explore each unique profession. And when their attention turned to the handlers of the dead, they understood that this was among the most terrifying occupations ever to exist. The profession of corpse handling in the Middle Ages stood at the very top of the list of jobs few dared to take on, for it was bound to death and the fear of plague. Workers often labored in graveyards, collecting bodies from battlefields or from homes where people had just died of famine or infectious disease. They had to dig deep graves before the ground hardened or wild animals arrived, forcing their work to be rushed and tense. Many lost their lives to illnesses contracted from corpses, for they had no protective gear beyond rough cloth wrapped around their hands and a makeshift face covering. Villagers avoided contact with them, believing they carried evil vapors, leaving those in the trade isolated and with few close companions. Grave digging demanded great endurance, especially when wet or frozen soil made each strike of the shovel twice as heavy as usual. Whenever a plague spread, they were forced to gather bodies in extremely short periods, working day and night amid suffocating, deathly stench. No one else wanted to approach the corpses, so they also had to collect the deceased's belongings to prevent disease from spreading throughout the community. During wartime, they went to battlefields after the fighting ceased, gathering bodies scattered among mud, splintered wood, and stray weapons. The evening light often reflected off the hurried trenches they had dug, casting the familiar gray gloom associated with their trade. Many claimed they heard the wind whistling through graveyards, like the cries of mourners haunting their minds, even though they had long grown accustomed to death. Villages paid them with food or small plots of land, yet the reward never matched the dangers they faced. At times, they had to fend off wild animals that dug up freshly buried graves, forcing them to guard burial sites at night with a small torch and a wooden staff. Because people feared them, they were seldom invited to festivals, making their spiritual lives lonelier than that of any other profession. Still, no one denied that they helped shield the village from disease and filth, allowing the community to survive in relative safety. Children were often warned to avoid graveyards, turning the figure of the corpse handler into a distant, eerie presence, like a character from nighttime tales. Those in the trade often bore deep, tired eyes, for they confronted human fragility every day more than anyone else. Some saw the profession as a way to atone for past mistakes, accepting its dangers as part of a silent journey of repentance. Though rarely respected, they continued their work because they knew that if they stopped, the village would face unimaginable consequences. Every filled grave carried its own sorrow, leaving behind a lingering silence, a reminder that life was far more fragile than people wished to believe. Looking at their lives, villagers came to understand the depth of their silent sacrifice. Even though few had the courage to walk such a dark path, the very existence of the profession protected the community from countless disasters, creating a quiet, unspoken gratitude toward them. As stories of corpse handlers spread, villagers naturally turned their eyes to the hunters of wild beasts, a profession no less terrifying. And this train of thought opened the image of those who ventured deep into the forest, confronting dangers that few had the heart to face. Hunters of wild beasts in the Middle Ages were considered the ones who faced danger most directly, for they ventured into deep forests where darkness always lurked. Their task was not merely to hunt rabbits or small deer, but to confront wolves, bears, and creatures capable of attacking entire villages. They often worked alone or in small groups, carrying only wooden spears, long knives, and a few crude iron traps that could easily break deep in the woods. Many hunters said that the roar of a bear, echoing from afar, could make even the most seasoned men shudder at its unpredictable power. Forest paths were slippery, blanketed with moss and fallen branches, causing them to stumble at the very moments they needed balance to dodge an animal's charge. Tracks left in the damp soil were often their only clues, though at times those very tracks led them straight into dangerous ambushes. An old hunter once said that the most perilous thing was not the large beasts, but the unnatural silence of the forest just before an attack. They kept hunting dogs and trained them to distinguish scents, but even dogs could flee when faced with a massive wolf pack. Their primitive weapons forced them to rely on agility and cunning rather than sheer strength, for a single deep claw mark could be fatal. When they captured a wild beast, they had to haul the carcass back to the village, passing through narrow trails, dark as cave mouths, places where other predators might lurk. Every expedition into the woods tested their spirit, for they never knew when the hunter would become the hunted, especially when thick fog settled. Villagers viewed them as heroes, yet stayed at a respectful distance, for hunters carried the scent of the forest and tales that sent chills down people's spines. After each season, some hunters never returned, leaving behind fading footprints in memory and a few old belongings found beneath the canopy. Those who survived often bore long scars across arms, shoulders, or faces, marks of their struggles with wild beasts on the forest paths. When wolves attacked livestock, hunters had to leave home in the dead of night, carrying torches flickering in the whistling wind. That light often reflected in the beast's eyes, revealing a fierce glint that forced the hunter to remain utterly calm. At times, they used bait set in clearings, rigged with hidden traps, waiting for the beast to be caught before rushing in for the kill. Many died when animals broke free or when a companion stepped into the wrong spot, turning the hunt into tragedy. They lived apart from others, often near the village's edge, where narrow trails led straight into the forest, allowing them to depart whenever duty called. Despite the danger, wild beast hunters protected livestock crops and even the villagers' lives, earning them deep respect. Their courage reminded the villagers that the forest was not only a source of wood and herbs, but also a boundary filled with trials. They became symbols of bravery, though few wished for their children to take up such a perilous profession. Through their stories, people soon thought of another dangerous trade, the extraction of resources from the dark earth below. And that line of thought naturally led to the image of miners, those who faced the eternal darkness of fragile tunnels. Medieval miners were among the laborers who faced the greatest risks, for they worked in narrow tunnels that could collapse at any moment. To find precious ore, they had to descend deep into the earth, where the faint light of a small torch was never enough to dispel the cold surrounding darkness. The air inside the tunnels was often thick and heavy, forcing them to breathe slowly to avoid dizziness caused by long hours of oxygen deprivation. Their crude tools, stone hammers, and worn iron chisels deteriorated quickly, requiring them to use sheer physical strength to break rocks hard as fortress walls. Many miners said that a sudden cracking sound could stop an entire group's heartbeat, for it signaled that the earth was about to come crashing down. Rock dust seeped into their mouths, noses, and eyes, causing constant coughing and leaving a burning sensation that lasted long after they returned above ground. Some mines were flooded by underground water, forcing them to bail water through the night to prevent a sudden deadly surge. Miners had to memorize the structure of the tunnels, for there were no drawings or guides. One wrong turn could lead to a suffocating dead end. At times, they encountered pockets of trapped toxic gas, causing entire groups to collapse before they even understood what was happening. In many villages, church bells rang out when news spread that a tunnel had collapsed, burying the entire mining crew beneath layers of stone. Wives and children stood at the mouth of the mine, hoping desperately to hear faint tapping sounds from deep underground, signs of life barely clinging on. Villagers could only attempt rescue with wooden shovels and crude tools, making their efforts painfully slow against the crushing weight of earth and rock. Often they found only a miner's hat or rope. The bodies beneath were crushed beyond recognition. Yet the mining profession never lacked workers, for iron, tin, and silver were essential lifelines for the entire domain. Miners lived near forests or at the foot of mountains, where strong winds blew across their thatched roofs like reminders of the darkness beneath the earth. Each morning they took deep breaths of fresh air before entering the tunnels, as if preparing their spirit for another silent battle. Chronic pains in their backs and arms revealed years of hard labor, yet they persevered, for few other professions suited them. When they emerged from the mines, their faces coated in gray dust made them look like people from a world darker than the one above. During festivals, miners seldom joined fully due to weakened health, though they held a quiet pride for their perilous trade. Young villagers listened to their stories with fear and curiosity, eventually realizing that not everyone had the courage to venture into the mines. Their resilience taught the community that the human heart could be stronger than even the deepest underground darkness. Thanks to them, metal could be brought to the surface to forge weapons, tools, and essential items that helped villages survive wars and long winters. And from the image of the miner villagers, imagination turned toward yet another dangerous profession, the tax collector serving the feudal lord. This journey took place not in the darkness of stone tunnels, but within the invisible hazards of human resentment, fury, and sudden violence. Tax collectors in the Middle Ages lived amid a whirlwind of dangers few truly understood, for they faced not only the anger of the poor, but also the pressure of their feudal lords. Their duty was to collect grain, livestock, or money from households to deliver to the landowner, a task that turned them into targets of resentment. They often traveled with a few guards, yet even that offered no guarantee of safety, as desperate villagers would sometimes resist violently. On narrow dirt paths winding through fields, they could be ambushed at any moment by disgruntled locals or wandering bandits. Scuffles frequently broke out during years of poor harvests, when villagers believed that losing even a little more grain would push their families into starvation. The tax collector had to maintain a cold and firm tone, even though they knew many taxpayers had nothing left but a few bags of dried seeds. If they failed to collect enough, they were punished by their lord. If they succeeded, they were hated by the villagers, forever trapped between two unforgiving sides. Some villages even whispered that tax collectors brought misfortune, making people wary of them and deepening the isolation of the profession. Tax collection journeys through sparse woodlands were especially dangerous, for bandits often hid there, waiting to strike small groups. When ambushed, the guards fought while the tax collector fled with books and ledgers in hand, carrying both fear and a damaged reputation. Some lost their lives when enraged villagers attacked, especially during sudden tax increases meant to fund wars or build lordly constructions. Children often hid behind doors when tax collectors arrived, hearing adults whisper about them as if an omen had stepped into the yard. Yet, a few tax collectors were fair, trying to negotiate to lessen the burden on the poor, though such actions risked arousing their lord's suspicion. They fully understood the danger, but persevered because no other work could support their families during such harsh times. Despite their efforts, they seldom slept in peace, fearing that someone might seek revenge in the night over painful tax debts. During festivals, they kept to themselves, for villagers avoided their gaze, sinking them deeper into loneliness. Stories spread of elderly tax collectors carrying a staff not for walking, but for defending themselves in crowds. When passing through villages devastated by crop failure, they had to collect taxes quickly and leave before resentment swelled into violence. Some lords even used this profession as punishment for those who opposed them, forcing them into a line of work riddled with danger. The Middle Ages lacked many comforts, but human emotions were never absent, ensuring that this profession always existed in turmoil and mortal risk. Such stories made people view tax collectors with a mix of fear and pity, for no one knew when they might fall victim to the dangers surrounding their work. Their existence maintained order within the domain, though the price they paid was sometimes their own lives. And as the image of the tax collector slowly faded down the rugged road, villagers were reminded of yet another perilous trade, the butcher. From there, the tale led them into the world of those who faced blood blades and fears that most people wished never to confront. The butcher's trade in the Middle Ages was viewed with a mix of necessity and fear, for butchers worked amid blood, the stench of raw flesh, and constant risk of injury. They had to slaughter and carve livestock to supply meat for the entire village, yet their working conditions were always damp, slippery, and poorly lit. Long blades could easily slip when their hands were wet with blood, causing them to injure themselves in a single moment of lost focus. Many butchers bore scars across their arms and shoulders, marks from blades rebounding, or animals struggling before being fully subdued. They often worked on the village outskirts, where the air was fresher, but fewer people passed by, making accidents more likely to happen undetected. When slaughtering cattle or large pigs, they had to coordinate perfectly with their assistants, for even a slight misstep could lead to fatal wounds. Blood pooling on the ground made every movement dangerous, forcing them to keep their balance Amid the chaos of animal cries and sharp blades, butchers also had to carry carcasses to the stream for washing, where predators might follow the scent of blood, exposing them to unexpected dangers. Many villagers avoided contact with butchers, believing them unclean, making the trade even lonelier. Despite its essential role, hours of carving left them with constant back pain, yet no one else was willing to enter the slaughterhouse, where the heavy smell of blood permeated everything. Children were often frightened by the sight of butchers, their clothes stained deep red and their faces stern like carved stone. No festival could take place without them, yet they always remained at the margins, for villagers hesitated to let those who smelled of blood join sacred rituals. When livestock went berserk in their pens, the butcher was the first to rush in and subdue them, a task as dangerous as it was bold. Many butchers met their end after being kicked, gored, or knocked into their own blades by panicked animals. They had to sharpen their knives daily, keeping the edges bright and keen, for a dull blade was more dangerous than anything else. In cold weather, numb fingers made gripping a knife difficult. In hot weather, the smell of meat could cause dizziness and deadly mistakes. Butchers often sighed when reflecting that though their income was steady, they paid for it with their health and the villagers' distant gaze. Some villages believed butchers absorbed killing aura, forbidding them from serving as witnesses in important ceremonies. Even so, villagers were always grateful, for without butchers they would have no meat for winter or for festivals, an indispensable necessity. Stories about them were full of contradictions, praising their bravery while also evoking the chilling nature of their work. Their image reminded everyone that some trades sustained entire communities, yet pulled their workers into constant danger. Thanks to them, winter tables were warm with food, though the price paid was far heavier than outsiders imagined. From this tale of blood and peril, villagers' thoughts turned toward another profession, one confronted not with blades, but with diseases more frightening than any wound. And that thread leads us to the healers, those who faced invisible death every single day. Healers in the Middle Ages practiced one of the most dangerous professions, for they faced illnesses with no known cure and an invisible fear that hung over entire villages. Without deep medical knowledge, they were forced to rely on forest herbs, inherited experience, and prayers to save their patients. Whenever disease spread, they were the first to step into the homes of the sick, where exhausted breaths and the bitter smell of medicine mingled in the heavy air. Many healers died young, constantly exposed to infected individuals and armed with nothing more than a cloth mask for protection. Villagers both depended on and feared them, believing they carried sickness with them, a belief that pushed healers into isolation despite their tireless efforts to save lives. On cold nights, they carried bags of herbs to desperate households, waiting for the faint hope of a miracle. Their knock at the door brought relief to many, but made others shudder, fearing the words, "Nothing more can be done." Healers had to boil medicines, pound roots, burn leaves, prepare steams, and call upon ancestral spirits to help the sick survive danger. Many herbs were poisonous if used incorrectly, leaving them constantly afraid they might unintentionally bring death to their own patients. When treating those with open sores or infections, they often develop burns or swollen hands, eventually collapsing from exhaustion after long days of work. Some villages even suspected them of practicing forbidden magic, forcing them to flee when a patient failed to recover. Healers had to endure scenes of wailing families, desperate pleas, and despair so deep it weighed heavily on their minds. While searching forests for rare herbs, they encountered wild beasts or slipped down rocky ravines hidden beneath moss. Many disappeared in the woods at night, leaving behind only a fallen basket of herbs, a silent reminder of the fragility of their vocation. Despite the distrust, healers were summoned whenever a child fell ill or an elder collapsed, for they were the final thread of hope. At festivals, they were honored for a brief moment, then avoided again, as villagers feared disease might cling to them. Many healers lived alone, for few wished to bind their lives to someone who faced invisible dangers every day. Still, they carried on, unable to stand by while others suffered without help. Every vial of medicine they prepared carried a silent prayer, a small wish that the patient might escape the death hovering near. To many, they were unseen warriors wearing armor made of herbs and thin faith as they battled illness. Their existence reminded villagers that some dangers cannot be seen, yet they take lives with ease. Healers accepted those risks to save others, even though the harsh world of their time offered them little chance of survival. From the faint silhouette of a healer returning through the fog, villagers' thoughts turned once more to another hazardous profession, one facing threats not of nature but of human malice. And that line of reflection led to the guides, those who survived only by braving deep forests, bandits, and danger on every side. Guides in the Middle Ages were seen as those who held the lives of entire caravans in their hands, for they determined every route through deep forests, swamps, and unfamiliar territories. They had to understand footpaths, streams, mountain slopes, and every sign of weather to keep travelers from falling into natural traps or crossing paths with lurking predators. Each journey was a gamble, for a single wrong turn could lead the group into a swamp from which escape was nearly impossible. Bandits often stalked the roads using decoys to trick guides into leading caravans into prearranged ambushes. Thus, guides had to read both animal tracks and human traces, discerning hidden threats beneath the forest canopy. Many were accused of treachery after disastrous journeys, even when it was nature itself that claimed lives. They carried long staffs, short knives, and pouches of herbs to stop bleeding, for they never knew what awaited them ahead. Forest winds rustled the leaves, masking the sounds of predators, forcing them to listen for even the faintest noise. Guides could read the sun's position, the color of soil, and the moisture of moss to determine direction in uncharted wilderness. At night, flickering torches lit only a few steps ahead, leaving them to rely on memory and instinct to lead the group safely. Many never returned from winter journeys when sudden snowstorms swallowed forests, mountains, and travelers whole. Survivors spoke of hearing long, echoing howls rising from deep ravines, sounds that halted the entire caravan in terrified silence. Lords often hired guides to cross borders, but once conflict broke out, the guides became prime targets for enemy forces. None of the travelers behind them understood the weight these guides carried, for if they fell, the entire group descended into despair. Village children viewed them as wanderers from distant worlds, carrying dust from far-off lands and eyes heavy with fatigue. Many guides bore scars on their shoulders from animal attacks, yet they continued the work because no profession needed them more. They lived solitary lives, rarely settling in one place, for their roaming existence made a stable home impossible. When they entered villages, they stayed only briefly at taverns before moving on, taking with them villagers' warnings about treacherous trails. Old merchants recounted that only skilled guides allowed them to escape regions controlled by bandits for months. Despite the danger, guides connected distant lands, bringing news goods and hope to places isolated by nature. People regarded them with reverence, for few dared to tread such perilous paths as they did. Their lives were an endless journey, each step capable of leading to safety or unfolding into unseen disaster. From the sight of their backs fading into the deep forest, villagers recalled yet another dangerous trade, the gathering of wild honey. And so the story turns to those who climbed cliff faces and faced fierce swarms of bees just to harvest precious drops of golden honey. Wild honey gathering in the Middle Ages demanded extraordinary courage, for gatherers faced both deadly heights and thousands of bees ready to attack. Honey was a rare sweetness regarded as liquid gold, so gatherers risked broken bones, fatal falls, or exhaustion from countless stings. They often scaled sheer cliff faces, relying only on rough ropes or precarious tree roots clinging to the edge of deep ravines. A single slip could send them plummeting onto jagged rocks below, where many before them had perished seeking large honeycombs. They carried clay pots of smoke to calm the bees, but sudden mountain winds could snuff out the flame, unleashing furious swarms upon them. Many returned with dozens of stings on their faces and hands, leaving swollen welts for days and sometimes causing them to faint on the way home. They had to study the cliff face, identifying cracks, roots, and loose patches of earth to find a safe foothold before approaching the hive. The deafening buzz around them made it hard to tell direction, while stinging smoke irritated their eyes, making balance even more precarious. A large hive could weigh as much as a sack of grain, forcing them to balance while cutting pieces of wax without shattering the comb. Many described the feeling of hanging in mid-air, separated from death by only a few handspans, their hearts pounding to the point of breathlessness. Honey gatherers had to work quickly, for if the bees regrouped into a larger swarm, they could engulf a person in mere breaths. Experienced gatherers could judge the richness of a hive by the color of its wax, though some hives proved empty, wasting their perilous climb. The journey back was often even harder, as they carried heavy combs while their arms and legs trembled from the ordeal. Some were chased down forest paths by bees, forcing them to run while trying to stay balanced on loose stones and tangled roots. Villagers saw them as daring souls, admired yet rarely imitated, for the mere thought of those cliffs filled others with dread. Children gathered around them after each return, marveling at the golden honey, even as the gatherers still trembled with exhaustion. Some lost their hearing over time from the constant droning of bees, yet continued the trade for lack of any better source of income. Even so, they knew each journey might be their last, for cliffs and enraged bees spared no mistakes. Villagers believed honey gatherers were protected by forest spirits, since they survived where ordinary people dared not tread. Thanks to them, honey appeared at festivals in healing remedies and in the rare meals needing sweetness to restore strength. The craft became a symbol of bravery, though the gatherers themselves understood the mortal price hanging over every expedition. Each drop of honey they returned with carried the fatigue and perseverance few could ever possess. From the sight of them suspended on cliffsides, people were reminded of yet another perilous trade defending the walls of the realm. And so the story turns to the warriors upon high ramparts where arrows and boiling oil constantly lurked. Watchmen on medieval ramparts faced danger more directly than anyone else, for they stood at the highest points where arrows and stones were fired straight at their bodies. Their task was to defend the gate guard against scaling ladders and prevent enemy troops from reaching the walls, making them the first targets in every battle. Beneath their feet the ground trembled with each blow from battering machines, shaking the ramparts so violently that keeping balance became a struggle. Enemy archers fired heavy flaming arrows, forcing them to dodge, while continuing to dump stones or boiling oil upon soldiers attempting to breach the walls. Strong winds atop the battlements blew smoke and flames back into their faces, burning their skin and stinging their eyes amid deafening battle cries. When enemies placed ladders, the watchmen had to rush forward and push them off while spearheads thrust upward, missing their bodies by mere breaths. Many fell to their deaths after slipping from the wall or were struck by stones launched from enemy siege engines. Rampart defenders wore heavy armor, making every movement slow and laborious in the cramped space of the battlements. They often fought for hours without rest, for even a moment's delay could shatter the entire defensive line. When night fell, they continued their vigil, as enemies often used darkness to dig tunnels or attack the gate, driving the watchmen to exhaustion. The heat from boiling oil spread across the walls, rising in scorching waves that blistered their hands as they tipped cauldrons over attackers below. In the rain, the walls turned slippery, making every move perilous. One misstep could send them falling straight onto the forest of spears beneath. Many defenders fought on, despite grievous wounds, knowing that leaving their post would create a deadly gap for their comrades. Survivors bore thick scars on their faces and arms marks left by fire arrows and stones throughout countless battles. Villagers respected them, yet viewed them with caution, for they returned scented with burnt oils and the metallic tang of blood. Even in times of peace, they patrolled and repaired the walls, for a single crack could become a fatal weakness when war returned. Some said that during night shifts atop the ramparts, they heard winds howling like the voices of fallen soldiers. The loneliness of the heights made them accustomed to darkness and distant echoes, as if they lived in a world separate from the village. Yet they stood their ground every time war approached, for without them, the entire domain would crumble beneath enemy footsteps. Rampart defenders knew death was always within arm's reach, but they remained proud to protect their homeland. Their stories reminded villagers that every measure of safety was paid for with the blood of those who stood on those high walls. Thanks to them, church bells continued to ring, and daily life carried on in fragile peace. From the image of warriors standing on the battlements, thoughts naturally shifted to another perilous trade, the coastal saltmaker. And so the tale moves into the harsh world where sun, wind, and seawater could kill as surely as any spear on the battlefield. Salt makers of the Middle Ages faced dangers that appeared quiet, yet were brutally unforgiving, for they worked long hours beneath burning sun and in salt water that ate away at their skin. The coastal salt flats stretched like blinding white mirrors, reflecting sunlight so intensely that workers grew dizzy and half-blinded even in the early morning. They stood in salt water all day, their feet blistering and cracking until every step burned, yet they had to continue working regardless. Sea winds carried fine grains of salt that clung to their wounds like needles, but the harvest could not wait for salt, had to be collected at precisely the right moment. Long dry seasons caused the water to evaporate quickly, forcing workers to constantly turn the salt to prevent clumping or ruin by unexpected tides. The rising tide was a deadly threat, for in just a few waves, entire salt fields could be swallowed, dragging workers into dangerous whirlpools. Many drowned when the tide surged without warning, especially those carrying heavy baskets that slowed their escape. Their simple tools, wooden rakes, and wicker baskets grew heavier as they soaked up water, making their shoulders ache until they went numb. The heat was so intense that some collapsed mid-field with no shade or nearby well to revive them. Salt clinging to open cuts often caused infections, leaving workers feverish or exhausted, yet they returned before fully recovering. During storm season, fierce winds could knock down anyone, shattering the salt pans and erasing weeks of labor in a single night. Coastal villagers said that the sound of big waves at night felt like a warning, keeping salt workers awake, with fear their fields would be destroyed. Children were rarely allowed to learn the trade, for parents knew the silent danger of sun and salt water could kill more easily than imagined. Many salt makers developed bent backs early, forever stooped from endlessly scraping heavy layers of salt under the unforgiving sun. Yet salt was precious, essential for surviving winter and for trading, so despite the risks, the craft remained indispensable. Salt workers were respected for their endurance and resilience against a nature none dared challenge outright. They seldom complained, knowing each grain of salt was the crystallization of sun, wind, and sweat bound to the meals of every family. Salt harvest season was both joyous and tense, for even a single bank of dark clouds could ruin the entire year's effort. The scraping of rakes across the flats formed a steady rhythm of perseverance, reminding them that this trade belonged only to the truly enduring. In the late afternoons, when the red sun cast its glow across the silver fields, salt makers knew they had survived one more day against the sea. The salt trade taught them that danger did not always come from blades or beasts, but also from sunlight and seawater that seemed gentle at first glance. Their endurance helped feed the village, preserving flavor and strength for the long, harsh winter. And from the sight of them standing alone on glaring white flats, thought naturally shifted toward one final profession, quiet yet fraught with peril. This was the messenger's trade, where couriers traveled long roads through forests and wilderness, facing threats from both humanity and nature. Messengers in the Middle Ages carried on their shoulders the secrets and commands of kings, lords, or village councils, turning every journey into a perilous mission. They had to cross forests, swamps, and desolate fields to deliver letters on time, for even a slight delay could spark war or shatter alliances. With no safe roads, they navigated by the sun, the shadows of trees, and faint footpaths only seasoned travelers could recognize. Bandits lurked everywhere, ready to kill them for letters or belongings, turning each stretch of road into a life or death confrontation. Most messengers carried only small knives or wooden staffs, weapons, too meager to fend off large groups of attackers. They were forced to run swiftly, hide behind bushes, or slip between rocks whenever suspicious sounds echoed from deep within the woods. Some letters carried messages so crucial that enemies hunted messengers like prey, making the profession even more deadly. Weather posed another threat. Heavy rain flooded paths while snow led them astray and drained their strength in the freezing wilderness. Messengers frequently crossed rotten wooden bridges where a single misstep could send them plunging into swirling waters below. Wolves and wild animals appeared unexpectedly during nighttime travel, forcing them to risk lighting torches, though the light could attract bandits. Many described hearing eerie howls across the night, pushing them to move faster before they wandered into a predator's territory. Countless messengers died in silence, leaving behind only fading footprints and letters that never reached their destination. Villagers were grateful to them, but understood that messengers rarely had stable homes, for their lives were endless roads stretching beyond horizons. When they returned, they were exhausted, carrying dust, sea wind, and the relief of having survived one more journey. Few understood their loneliness, for day after day, month after month, they heard nothing but wind, footsteps, and their own heartbeat. Even upon arrival, they could not rest long, for another letter always awaited, binding them to an unending thread of danger. Messengers chose their words wisely, knowing that the secrets they carried could turn them into targets, even within unfamiliar strongholds. They also faced suspicion from foreign villagers, stopped and questioned by guards who did not recognize them, making every gateway a moment of dread. Yet they pressed on, for information was the lifeblood of the realm, and they were the fragile chain preventing the land from falling into chaos. Their importance was only realized when a letter failed to arrive, and only then did people understand the price messengers paid on the road. Through the journey of the messenger, we see clearly that every dangerous profession in the Middle Ages carried a price no one wished to pay. These people, from hunters and miners to butchers and healers, each helped keep society alive amid unpredictable darkness. And looking back upon all these perilous trades, people understood that the village's peace never came naturally. It was built from the sweat, blood, and courage of those who dared to walk where no one else would tread.